বেঁকিয়ে দেবে এইদিকে, মানে একটু দেয়ালের দিকে পেশেন্টটা চলে যাবে। ট্রলি দুটো লাগবে। আরো কাছ থেকে নে, আরো কাছে যাও, যাও 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 যাও, আমি বলে দিচ্ছি, যাও যাও যাও। হ্যাঁ, ঠিক আছে ঠিক আছে। তো ওইখানে ছোট দেখো মান আমাদের করছে একটু ওখানে।
এই শোন, এই লাইটটা একটু লোয়ের দিয়ে রাখবি।
ছোট সরল তো দেখি।
হ্যাঁ, এই দুটোই সুন্দর, দুটো চাই।
খারাপ নেই তো, ঠিকই আছে।
তাহলে এর একটা ওইখানে দিয়ে দিই, এর একটা ওইখানে দিই।
না ওইটা আমার তো, ওটা তো আজকে আসবেই না ওখানটা। ওখানে ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ডে কি আসছে দেখে তাহলে ওটা থেকে এখানে
ফ্লোরটা যেন পায়। এটা থাকছে,
এটা কিন্তু শর্টে আসছে না, আমি সরিয়ে দিচ্ছি।
এটা সরিয়ে দাও, এটা সরিয়ে পিয়ানোটা এখানে থাকবে।
ওখানে ভালো লাগবে না। কি 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 না। Wait a minute. Keep it for a while.
Hey, Bola. Hey, Bola. Bola.
Very difficult decision. Actually, I would have preferred it slightly browner. It's too black. It doesn't belong to you, right?
হ্যাঁ না, সেটা জাস্ট মানে এখন তুলি
Tolo. We'll try it like this. Without. You don't mind?
No, it's all right. Okay. বাইরে আলোটা জ্বালা তো, বাইরে আলোটা জ্বালা। এদিকে যা। হ্যাঁ ঠিক আছে, রাখো ঠিক আছে। পরে সুজি লাগিয়ে দিচ্ছি, পরে ফুটোটা আমি মিলিয়ে পাকা ফুটি মিলিয়ে মুড়িয়ে দেবো। না হলে পরে ফিজিক্যাল থাকবে না।
থাকবে না? বাস 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 বাস।
আমার লাইট রেডি।
কালকে ফুল শট যখন পড়বে তখন দিয়ে
ঠিক আছে। এই দুটো ফাইট দাও তো আমাকে, ভালো আইটা ঠিক আছে?
ঠিক আছে।
কি দেবো? ক্লিপ দুটো। হ্যাঁ, দিলীপের কাছ থেকে দাও না, দিলীপের কাছ থেকে দুটো ক্লিপ চেয়ে দিয়ে দাও।
রায় আমাকে কি 2 শটটা 35 দিতে হবে, ফুল ব্যাগটা একটুখানি ডেপ না হলে তো পিছিয়ে লাগবে। করছো তো? ঠিক আছে। That's all. That's the shot. That's the shot. কোনো চলবে না। এই পজিশন রায়। ঠিক আছে, এখানে Jennifer, take your position at the piano and fake. Come on, Adi. We'll do it here.
লাইট ছেড়ে ক্যামেরা দাও।
জানি ওর কাছে শুনছো। আচ্ছা ঠিক আছে, তাহলেও আমার মনে হয়
নেটটা ধরো তো, ধরে দিবে করে দেখি, আমি দেখবার। এবার এক কাজ করো, কমিয়ে দাও লাইটটাকে। এবার একটা আমি ক্যামেরাটা বসে যাই। হ্যাঁ, ক্যামেরাটা বসে আমি করবো। এবার এই ওয়াশটাকে অফ করে এবার কন্ট্রোল ওয়াশ করো।
Thanks, Adi. That was lovely. Oh, Babu? Huh?
কাটো 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 ওটা কি পারবে তো লেফট রাইট হ্যাঁ বেটার করো আছে ঠিক আছে
Okay? Ready? Actor? Actor rehearsal, Leonie? One rehearsal, please. The last time was fine. Let's try it. You, you're not actually reading the book, are you?
No.
You got it all by heart. Okay. No. I want to cheat your look a bit towards the left. Okay?
Yes.
লাস্টটা ওয়াটটা বড় ওরে গো মা বুঝলে এটা কে বসেছে নামটা ভুলে গেলাম সামওয়ান অ্যান্ড্রু কি
আর দুজন দাঁড়াও তো ওখানে একটু কেউ
1 by 1 take 1
Action. Perfect. She has you. That would be your cue. Good morning, Mr. Chaudhary. Good morning. How's your pupil doing? Ask her. She'll tell you.
Don't I say that? I was hoping you'd come one of these days. Don't I?
What?
I was hoping you'd come one of these days.
Yes, indeed. Isn't it in your
Yes, it is, yes.
Ah, where does it come?
Right
Over there,
after
right there.
good morning.
No, she says something about the
Yes,
thing.
we're making very good progress, Mr. Chaudhary. We had 10 minutes of conversation today.
Really?
Oh, really?
That's where it really comes from.
And history and geography. Her grammar's improving tremendously. A lot.
Not geography.
No, her history, her grammar. Her grammar's improving so much. She wrote a very good essay about birds in her garden.
Really?
And I see she can sing too.
Ah, yes, and I can see, yes.
All you can say is, I see she can sing too.
I was on my way back from church. I saw them standing by the roadside.
You have your dialogue, which is the latest version.
Is the right one.
Right one, absolutely.
No,
No.
no. That's all I say.
Oh, that's what you
Yes,
meant.
yes,
Okay.
that's all.
You may be looking for really.
Yes.
That's
I think they should do this to me.
Okay, then I said they're doing some very stupid things these days, Miss Gilby.
No. What?
Yeah.
They're doing some very stupid things.
No, no. Oh, no. Sorry.
You've gone back there?
Yes. I smiled at them. One of them picked up a stone. It was too dreadful. That's what I said.
They're doing some very stupid things these days, Miss Gilby.
I don't blame the boys as much as I blame some of our political leaders.
ভালো কে বেঠে শুধু বেঠে
Was that right?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
that's it.
মাইদা মাথা
Oh. খোলো 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 কোথায় দিচ্ছ তুমি
এই যে ওটা
একটু ওপরে এইখানটা
ক্যামেরাটা পজিশন করে ওটা লাগান
কোথায় ইটস অল স্লাইডিং ডাউন একটা জায়গায় তো দেখতে পাচ্ছি না আমি হ্যাঁ ওইখানটা দাও ও থাকছে না কিছু হ্যাঁ ওইরকম ভাবে স্মিয়ার করো হ্যাঁ তাহলে থাকবে না রাইট হ্যাঁ
Not today. I've been to church. Bad. Husband standing outside the grocery store.
একটা জিনিস করতে হবে
I smiled at them.
চেয়ারটাকে তুলতে হবে
হ্যাঁ আমি চারটে ইট বলেছি
যদি না ক্যামেরাটা আরো নিচে করতে
না ক্যামেরাটা নিচে হবে না আমি চারটে চেয়ার এই ইট চারটে ইট এনেছিস না এটা
কোন দিকে তাকিয়ে ইমপ্লিকেশন এটা কত আছে হ্যাঁ বুঝতে পারছো Victor,
এই পজিশনে উনি আউট
Victor, come on. Oh,
মাইদা এটা কমবে এটা একটু কমাও তো কি আছে আউট হ্যাঁ দেখি আনছো
ক্যামেরা একটু লো হলেই হয়ে যেত
না, ক্যামেরা
লাগতো না
লাইসন
এবার দেখি তোমাকে এই Silence.
Such a shock, Mr. Chowdhury. Such a shock. To think they should do this to me.
Schoolboys,
I know their faces. They used to smile at me and greet me. And now today, I don't know what came over, but I'd been to church and on the way back, I passed them standing outside the grocery store. I smiled at them and then one of them picked up a stone. Oh, it was too dreadful.
They're doing some very stupid things these days, Miss Kilby. I don't blame our boys as much as I do some of our politicians.
It's not so much the pain, Mr. Chowdhury. It's the shock. I don't know what to do now. I can't stay here after this, and I'll be sorry to leave. You've been so good to me, you and Bimla.
That is the best, unquestionably.
शेर भर आटा
सेर भर आटा
हाँ आधा सेर चावल बोल
आधा सेर चावल
पाव भर दाल
पाव भर दाल
आधा पाव घी
आधा पाव घी
हाँ, नॉन हल्दी याद रहेगा बोल तो
एक सेर चावल
शेर भर आटा
सेर भर
That's so.
आधा सेर चावल
पाव भर दाल
पाव भर दाल आधा पाव घी
नॉन हल्दी
हल्दी
हाँ सुना मत शेर भर आटा आधा सेर चावल
Masha, don't do that slapping because it has been done with bangles already.
Oh, it's been done.
It makes a slightly different sound if you have bangles. Lovely, more sort of tinkly kind of sound.
I can't sit there.
Lovely.
पंडित जी क्या जाना था ना आज सवेरे?
That's no shouting. Bombay gabbing. The rest is okay. Location.
How could they get here?
यहाँ भेज के लिए क्या?
और क्या
I was born in a place called Garpar Road, in a printing press, actually. In fact, it was a huge building which housed the printing and block-making department, which my grandfather had started. It called Uriah and Sons. I was born there in 1921, and I spent the first 6 years of my life in that place.
I think the most vivid memory is of the printing press and the block-making department, because I used to spend my afternoons there. To come out. They would always say, yes, it'll come out next month, but it never did. That really is the dominant memory, and the smell of turpentine, which I had forgotten it, but I smelt it I went to a press when I was in advertising and suddenly smelled turpentine there, and immediately all the memories of Garpar came rushing back, you know.
Got a feel one drama. Smell of printing ink. Chalo.
I didn't have actually any brothers or cousins or anything, but there was a servant's son. We used to fly kite every afternoon from the roof, and they had this puja, Vishwakarma, on which particular day the sky is just full of kites.
I never saw my grandfather because he died 5 or 6 years before I was born. And my father fell ill almost about the same time that I was born, and he was almost in bed most of the time for about 2.5 years. He had Kala-Azar, and he died in 1923. I was 2.5 then. Another 3 years, I think, we stayed in Garpar Road in North Calcutta. Then the business folded up for reasons which I never found out. My mother and I moved to a maternal uncle's house towards South Calcutta, Bhawanipur. My mother and I were staying there.
See, I remember her as working. She was a very hard worker. She used to do embroidery, clay modeling, spend holidays, very exciting holidays, in hill stations in Bihar. And we spent a long holiday in Darjeeling, I remember, when she took a job in a school called Maharani Girls' School. And the first sight of Kanchenjunga is unforgettable. That I remember very, very well. At 6 o'clock in the morning, my mother woke me up and said that come and have a look. And I stood at the window, and there were the snows, red, pink, with the sunlight, the snow catching the sunlight. And the first sight of sea at Puri was very, very exciting also. And then my uncle's first motor car, then our trips to the Maidan every afternoon and around the Victoria Memorial.
And then at the age of 9, I started going to a school. It was called the Baliganj Government High School. It did turn out to be a very good school. This would be 1930 when I joined school.
And I was interested in games quite a bit, more as an observer. I was very interested in football and cricket, and there were cricketers in the family. The leading Bengali cricketer was an uncle of mine.
Even before my grandfather brought out his children's magazine, he had done, for instance, he had done abridgments for children of Mahabharata and Ramayana, and another collection of stories which, from the Mahabharata, which do not directly relate to the Pandavas and Kauravas. You know that there are lots of stories within stories, and they were already very famous. They were among the first abridgments for children, and they have not been improved upon since. And he was quite close to the Tagore family because they had the same kind of activity. In fact, the Tagores brought out one of the first children's magazines long before Sandesh, and he was writing for that also. And he was a friend of Abanindranath, who was a painter, because they have this common interest there. And Rabindranath, who was about the same age as my grandfather, they were very close to each other, particularly because of my grandfather would often go to Tagore's house in Joashako in Calcutta to play the violin during the Magh festival of the Brahmos. They have the Maghotsava, it's called, and he was needed to play the violin along with the chorus and the solos. So he was very close to them. But around 1912, 13, he felt that he had to bring out his own magazine. By that time, the printing press was well established. And you can see from the first year or two of Shandesh that the quality of printing was extraordinarily high. But soon after that, my grandfather died, and my father took over. But he was also a very extraordinary writer and illustrator. He was not as professional as my grandfather as an illustrator, but he had certain unique qualities, like the drawings that he did for his nonsense rhymes, or the funny stories that he wrote. He had an absolutely unique style of doing comic illustrations, which nobody else has revealed in India.
I remember songs and singing a great deal because my mother used to sing very well and my aunt was quite a celebrated singer. She used to make records for HMV. And I remember very vividly my trip to the HMV, the Gramophone Company studios, and the first recording session which I attended, I think about 6.5 or 7 at that time. They were before the electrical recording days. They used to have to sing in front of a horn. And they were all English engineers.
For some mysterious reason, there were some records of classical music in our house, although nobody was really interested. Western classical music, there was one movement of Beethoven's violin concerto. There was the usual things which I think even Bengalis bought them, violin records by Chrysler, songs by Shaliapin and things like that. Every sort of well-to-do or upper-class Bengali, middle-class house had some records of Western music. Violin was very popular as an instrument, so there would be records of Chrysler playing odd pieces. Sketching, painting, drawing, I had it at the back of my mind while I was in college or even late school that I would be a professional artist doing perhaps some kind of commercial art. But I had no training for that.
When the time came for me to decide what subjects I should specialize in, I had a very close friend of my father's who was a statistician, Professor Mahalanobis. You may have heard of him. And he said that you study economics because I have a magazine called, statistical magazine called Sankha. You can always get a job there for 250 rupees a month or something. I was not terribly interested in economics, really. And I think my 2 years as a student of BA was more or less wasted. I lost interest in college because it was not my subject. I had to study it. I passed. I got an honors in economics. But it was not really my subject. But then
my mother suggested, and I also agreed rather readily, that I should go to Shantiniketan, spend some time there. And Tagore was still living, and they had some marvelous teachers like Nandalal Bose and Binod Mukherjee, Ramkinkar Bej. And to be there for some time, she thought that it would be a good thing to be in Shantiniketan, in proximity to Tagore. I had some reservations about Indian art, the wishy-washy kind of rather sentimental stuff which used to come out in Ramananda Chatterjee's magazine, Modern Review, and Pravasi at that time. Every month there was a color reproductions, and I didn't very much care for those. But I found eventually, after joining Shantiniketan, that Indian art could also be very strong and virile, and it's not all sentimental, sort of Victorian kind of stuff. But I studied painting in Shantiniketan, but never meant to become a painter. I needed the background of Indian classical arts, perhaps to be able to use it in commercial art later. So I got to know about Eastern art, Chinese, Japanese, our own schools, and also Western art. I mean, starting from early Egyptian or cave paintings, rock paintings, down to post-impressionists or even the later ones.
When you came to Calcutta looking for a job, did you find it very difficult?
No, actually I found it very easily. It so happened that there was somebody who knew the assistant manager of DJ Kumar, who was a Bengali chap. And it turned out that we had known that family I knew his brother, sister, my wife knew the family very well. And so this old chap took me to Mr. D.K. Gupta, who eventually founded Signet Press. And I was just almost an apprentice, actually, a junior visualizer. I was getting 65 rupees a month, 15 rupees DNS allowance. I was learning visualizing and typography and layouts, and there was a lot of illustration in those days, not like now where you have mostly photographs. Illustrators were actually needed in those days. There was a lot of hand-drawn illustration, not photography, not models so much. Not very few in those days, actually.
And also a lot of typographical work done by hand.
Also, yes indeed, because we didn't have a very wide range of types in those days. So that I was doing, and I think one series which came later, it was a series for Paludrin, enormous ads, just an illustration of various classes of people in Calcutta, lower middle class, even Englishmen. I think there was part of there was a series of 6 ads showing in great detail the interior of the houses. The idea was to take a Paludrin every Sunday morning. So somebody was taking a Paludrin or distributing a Paludrin. There were children around. So that's very filmic, very, very filmic. What I was getting slightly fed up of was this having to deal with the clients, you know.
Yes.
Working as almost as a... No, that was very demeaning, I found, often. You have very few enlightened clients, actually. Very demeaning, and I was really getting very tired of advertising, and I wanted to be absolutely free as an artist. Cinema came, of course, much later. I think in my early school days, my main interest was stars. I was really a film fan. And I used to read magazines like Picture Gore and Photoplay and Film Pictorial and things like that. But then, gradually, I think early years in college, I became more and more interested in the directorial aspect of filmmaking. I became aware of the director. And I was reading up on people like John Ford and Ernst Lubitsch and William Wyler and Frank Capra, and looking for their speciality in a film, their sort of special characteristics. I saw whatever John Ford films that I could get to see. And then, even later, early 40s, late 30s, the Hollywood comedies and the Hollywood thrillers and very hard-edged films like the Billy Wilder films of the early 40s, Double Indemnity and Lost Weekend, and comedies like Major and the Minor, Leo McCare's comedies like With Cary Grant and Irene Dunne, which were very, very fine. I have re-seen them on television, and they are still marvelous. And the Frank Capra films of the 30s like It Happened One Night and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and all the others. So they were very, very well-crafted films. So my education really is based on these extremely well-written, well-directed, well-shot, well-acted films of the 30s and 40s. I got to know American films made by French directors who had left France and settled in Hollywood, like Duvivier, Renoir himself, and a few others, and the Germans like Fritz Lang and others who were making American films, but making them in a very German sort of way. And same goes for the French films. For instance, Renoir's first film that I saw was The Southerner. It's an American story, acted by Americans, but looking completely different from the American films. It was more French than, one could certainly recognize a completely new approach, narrative approach, a new style of filmmaking from looking at this American film made by a French director. So when Renoir came here, I was familiar with his French-American films, like The Southerner and the various other things that he made, Diary of a Chambermaid, This Land Is Mine. But I didn't know his French films yet.
Come here, Zuni. Johnny?
But in Shantiniketan, I was away, cut off from films. So I remember that Citizen Kane came and went in Calcutta, and I was away in Shantiniketan. It was great regret that I was not in Calcutta when Citizen Kane was shown. But I made up for the lack of looking at films by reading on the cinema as an art form. Nobody thought that the cinema was a very reliable profession or one should go into filmmaking. No, it was not that, certainly. I was thinking more in terms of a job as a commercial artist. Films of something to enjoy, not to make myself. No, there was no question of that at all. In fact, that came very much later, even when we were running the Film Society. We were anxious to study films, not to make them, but to understand them better. And even when I the first time got involved or was about to get involved in a film, it was as a script writer. One of my hobbies was taking up a story which has been sold for filming to somebody else, do my own treatment and compare it with the treatment on the screen. At one time it was as an art director. Jyotirmoy Roy was making a film and he offered the job of the art director to me, which didn't happen. Eventually it was Bansi and Shubho Tagore who did the art direction of that film. And then when we decided to do Tagore's Ghare Baire, I was to be the screenwriter. I had a contract as a screenwriter with a certain producer. And my friend Harisharan Dasgupta was supposed to be the director. It was only after I decided on Pathir Panchali, after reading the book when I illustrated it, that the idea of turning that into a film and directing myself occurred to me. So that was that. I mean, it had to be a choice of a subject, and it just so happened that since I knew this best, and I wanted to handle children, I thought I had it in me to do so. And this business of the...
When you started making films, Mr. Ray, did you feel anything, did you have a view about the state of cinema in India?
Well, we were certainly very strongly critical of Bengali films of that period. In fact, that's one of the things that we did at the Film Society. We were studying foreign films and we were having seminars and things on the Indian cinema of that period, and we were all very strongly critical. We found most of our stuff very false, unrealistic, shoddy, commercial in a bad way, and that sort of thing. We were very theatrical.
But when you decided to make a film, how did you go about writing a script for it?
I really started as a scriptwriter with my second film when I had more confidence. What I did was, you see, I had to go from door to door to various distributors and producers to
tell them the story in order to interest them so that they would put up money, I did a book of drawings of the film, of frames,
Yes.
fairly elaborately done in wash, black and white. And I would tell them the story and at the same time show them the drawings. And this is what I had even when I started the film. The actors would be given their lines a week before shooting, and we had discussions with the crew, with my assistants, with my cameraman, so he knew the setups more or less, and we knew the trend of the story, we knew the structure of the story. Pather Panchali, there was really no script as such. There were notes and things like that, and I had it all in my head. I mean, there were notes for dialogue. Most of the dialogue came from the book. I didn't know how to write dialogue. I didn't have any confidence as a dialogue writer at that point. But fortunately, Vibhuti Bhushan wrote very lifelike dialogue.
One might say there is a Satyajit Ray style of filmmaking. But when you look at Pather Panchali, for instance, in the use of lenses, sometimes it appears that there is a certain arbitrariness in the way the lenses have been used.
Oh, certainly, that is possible, because that's one of the hardest things to learn, I think, which lens to use at which point.
Yes, and then also you
And
have...
we didn't always have the lenses that we would like to have. You know, we were using 3 different cameras. In the film, there's a Mitchell, old Mitchell, there's a Bolex, there's an IMO used, and there's a wall camera used, so whatever was available for hire, we were using, and they didn't always come with the right lenses. So we didn't leave us much of a choice. I mean, we probably worked with only 2 lenses for long stretches, like 35 and 50, or 35 and 75.
Yes. But what about pacing? For instance, if you don't write a detailed script, or even a treatment, how would you get an indication of how you're going to pace
Well,
the
if you have it fairly clearly in your head, I suppose that's enough. You shoot according to what is in your head, rather than what's on paper.
Yes.
Because the unit, the crew members get to know what the story, how the story goes, etc.
Yes.
But at that point, since we were shooting maybe only 4 or 5 days a month, sometimes not even that, there was a 6-month gap when there was no shooting and no money. So that was all right.
Yes.
There was no sort of compulsion to write a script, because we had all the time in the world to shoot the film. In fact, we learned filmmaking through the process of making Pather Panchali. We knew nothing. Most of us knew. And in fact, the editor was also comparatively new. He'd probably come one film before that. And in the final cut, at the time of final cutting, we were rushed. There's no question. So we might have done unorthodox things without realizing it. That's it, because the final cut was done over a period of 10 days and 10 nights, working all the time, because we had a deadline to catch.
But you did have, say, for instance, even if Pather Panchali was a first film, there was quite a remarkable control, particularly with the climactic moment when the husband comes back, when Harihar comes back, and it was such a sophisticated thing.
We shot the film in sequence, starting with the early part and going on chronologically.
Yes, yes.
So the early part shows there are a lot of rough edges in the early part,
Yes.
in the cutting, in the shooting, in everything, in acting, everything. Whereas I knew all the difficult parts came after the second half,
Yes.
starting with the old woman's death, and then, of course, reaching a climax with Durga's death and Harihar's arrival, father's arrival, and the very end of the film. So by that time we had learned a little, and don't forget that it took us 2.5 years to make the film, which means that we probably had some shooting 1 year, and we had 4 or 5 months to think about it, to look at the rushes, to judge, to find out the mistakes, and not to make the same mistakes again.
Yes.
So it was like that. I feel that the second half is distinctly better made than the first half. You can see it.
Mr. Ray, I'm referring now to the Opu trilogy. There's a lot that appears in that film by way of detail, which is not used only for information's sake, but also it expresses much more. It expresses relationships between people. It expresses emotions at that particular time and so on. Now, I can give you a few examples. Then in Oparajito, there are any number of those wonderful details. When Harihar is ill, and he tries to button his shirt.
The idea of using details came
Well, firstly from other films, from films which I admired, and also from Vibhuti Bhushan himself, the writer of Pather Panchali. He is a writer who uses details like this often, very often, in a very effective sort of way, and which are very, very cinematic, and they can be used. I mean, for instance, there's a situation in a story which is not filmed where you have, I'll tell you exactly because this is very, very filmic. You have this family, the father goes insane, and it's impossible to keep him at home. The family decides to leave him somewhere else. So the son, young boy, and the group of elders take this madman and just take him a couple of miles away and leave him behind a bush, push a packet of berries in his hand and a cigarette and a matchbox, and just leave him there. And the boy, who feels for the father, suddenly turns around on the way back and finds smoke coming out from behind the bush. And it's very, very cinematic because the madman is smoking, you know. That sort of thing is very cinematic, and it comes from, often from literature and from Vibhuti Bhushan. I have used that kind of detail, often so that I do not have to use words, spoken words. Trying to be as expressive as possible through action, through objects, through details, things like that.
তুমি নামো, আমি আসছি। এসো। আমার ঘর দাও। তুমি বসো, আমি আসছি।
Sometimes you are left with no choice but to use a literary kind of symbol, as in Jalsakar, where the problem. But at other times, I think even after trilogy, even in films like Charulata and others, you find details of this nature.
But when you are already on the script stage now with Vibhuti Bhushan's novels, of course, you've mentioned this, but when you're yourself working them out, does it happen at the scripting stage or when you are actually starting to shoot and it might occur to you then?
Well, very important details can be there in the script stage itself, but details of action, as you suggested that in Aparajito you have the father trying to button his shirt,
Yeah.
but being ill, the wife, sort of does it for him. He said, brushes it. But probably that sort of thing is often happens in the stage of filming. At the time of filming, you suddenly have an idea, which will make a shot or a scene or an action more expressive, more telling. That you always, there's always room for improvisation of that nature during shooting.
The trilogy shows yet another quality, which I don't believe was part of the Indian cinema at all until that time, which is that you don't use what one might call automatically information scenes, scenes that are obligatory, that are to explain a particular situation and so on. There are, there are very, very few scenes in the trilogy where you might say that this is an information scene. You have been able, like in Opu Sansar, for instance, when young Opu is talking about his novel, on the tracks, and when he starts to talk about the book he's going to write, which is really his autobiography. I mean, this is done with such economy.
একটি ছেলে
Hmm?
একটি ছেলে আচ্ছা গ্রামের ছেলে বেশ দরিদ্র কিন্তু সেনসিটিভ বাপ পুরুষ মারা গেল আচ্ছা ছেলেটি শহরে সে পুরুতগিরি করবে না পড়বে অ্যাম্বিশাস পড়ল শিক্ষার ভেতর দিয়ে স্ট্রাগলের ভেতর দিয়ে আমরা দেখতে পাচ্ছি তার কুসংস্কার গোঁড়ামি সমস্ত কেটে যাচ্ছে বুদ্ধি দিয়ে ছাড়া সে কোনো কিছু মানতে চাইছে না কিন্তু তার কল্পনা শক্তি আছে তার অনুভূতি আছে ছোটখাটো জিনিস তাকে মুভ করছে তাকে আনন্দ দিচ্ছে হয়তো তার ভেতরে মহৎ একটা কিছু করার ক্ষমতা আছে সম্ভাবনা আছে কিন্তু করছে না কিন্তু সেটি শেষ কথা নয় সেটি ট্র্যাজেডিও নয় সে মহৎ কিছু করছে না তার দারিদ্র যাচ্ছে না তার অভাব মিটছে না কিন্তু তা সত্ত্বেও সে জীবন বিমুখ হচ্ছে না সে পালাচ্ছে না এসকেপ করছে না সে বাঁচতে চাইছে সে বলছে বাঁচার মধ্যে সার্থকতা তার মধ্যে আনন্দ মানে
এটা উপন্যাস কোথায় এটা আত্মজীবনী
কিছুটা আত্মজীবনী অনেকটাই কল্পনা তাছাড়া কাল্পনিক চরিত্র আছে প্লট আছে প্রেম আছে
হ্যাঁ
প্রেম ওয়াই নট
প্রেম
ওয়াই নট
তুই প্রেম সম্বন্ধে কি জানিস
কেন
তুই প্রেম সম্বন্ধে জানিসটা কি জীবনে কোনো মেয়ে 10,000 মধ্যে গিয়েছিস তোর প্রেম সম্বন্ধে কোনো এক্সপিরিয়েন্স আছে
নাই বা থাকলো
নাই না থাকলে বাবা বুঝানি উপন্যাস লেখা কি এতই সহজ
সব জিনিসের এক্সপিরিয়েন্স থাকতে আলবাত ইমাজিনেশন কল্পনা শক্তি এসবের কোনো দাম নেই
না অন্তত প্রেমের ব্যাপারে নেই নেও
কে বলেছে তোকে
আমি বলছি
তোর মুন্ডু তুই জানিস না একটা লোকের যদি ট্যালেন্ট থাকে তাহলে সে সব কিছু না না একটা লোক যদি
But in the later films, again, sometimes you find that there are obligatory scenes,
Yes.
There is a kind of information.
I think, they arise out of the material, which you cannot help sometimes. Sometimes you have to use the conventional methods, sometimes you can do without them. I don't think that the methods which I used in Opu Sansar and the other trilogy films, I do not find useful anymore. It's just because of that I have stopped using them. It's just that I've been using different other kinds of material, which demand other kinds of treatment.
Was there a kind of autobiographical resonance in these two
Well,
novels?
not in Pathir Panchali, frankly, because I knew hardly anything about village life. I was a city-born and city-bred person, and I didn't know the village at all till the age of 30, 25 or 30. But in the second part, the fact of Opu's adolescence and mother being a widow, mother and son relationship, that can have autobiographical elements in it, certainly, because I was in a similar situation.
Did you identify with Opu?
I suppose one does. One has to, particularly when you deal with a character through 3 films, and right from his childhood to adulthood, and you do identify. Otherwise, there's no getting under the skin of the character.
But tell me, did you plan it as a trilogy when you first started Pathe Panchali?
Oh, no question of that. In fact, I couldn't see beyond just one film at that point when I made Pathe Panchali. But it was only after the acceptance of Pathe Panchali by the public in Calcutta itself, before it won prizes or anything, that I really decided to give up advertising and go into filmmaking. And I looked for a second subject for a while. Then it suddenly struck me that why not make another film about Oppo? But there was this other book, Aparajito left, and I made it. And then, even after making Aparajito, I didn't have a trilogy in mind because Aparajito was a failure, the box office failure. So I had to think of doing something completely different. I did a comedy that worked reasonably well, and then I did Jalsakar, the music room.
Yes.
Because even Parashmata, the comedy, wasn't such a success. So I was again in doubts about what kind of a film to make, and I decided to make a film about music and dancing, the conventional, the sort of formula that the Bengali public was used to. Although in developing it, it became a completely different kind of film. It was not a light-hearted commercial sort of thing at all. After Aparajito won the prize in Venice, at the press conference, I was asked whether I had a trilogy in mind, and I found myself saying yes.
Mr. Ray, your work appears to fall, and there seem to be certain distinct changes that have occurred, particularly after Charulata. In the beginning, most of the films that you handled, there was a very distinct lyrical kind of an approach. There appeared to be a couple of films in between which seem like an aberration almost to this whole thing, but it concludes with Charulata, and then you have very different kind of sensibility starting to operate. What do you think the reason for this is?
One thing which I have tried to do is not to repeat myself thematically. I made the trilogy, okay, but in between I had made a comedy, and I had made a film about the past, about Zamindar, and then again, I have gone back to that from time to time. Devi was about the 19th century.
Ma, এতদিন কেন বলিসনি মা? কি করছেন আপনি? একে প্রণাম করো বাবা। আমি স্বপ্নযোগে আদেশ পেয়েছি, ইনি দেবীর অবতার। সব আরাধনা আজ সার্থক হলো, জীবন আজ আমার সার্থক হলো।
I think a director is fascinated not only by theme or subject matter, but also by certain visual aspects of a story. I'm interested in recreating the past in the visual aspect of opulence, for instance. That fascinates me very much. So occasionally I do that. And Charulata was certainly a culmination of that. But after that, I decided, perhaps it's difficult to recall the exact states of mind which promoted you to do certain things. I perhaps felt that maybe I came across certain contemporary stories by young writers, which dealt with local contemporary problems of Calcutta of that time. And I decided to, again, for a change, to do some of those stories.
Would you say that, the environment was changing around you? There was an effect of that on you?
That did happen towards the end of the 60s and the early 70s. I would describe that as a period which was so strong, you felt certain changes taking place, almost in day-to-day existence you felt it, and you felt that without that you couldn't make a film.
Who was the Prime Minister of England at the time of independence?
Whose independence, sir?
Our independence.
Attlee.
What would you regard as the most outstanding and significant event of the last decade?
The war in Vietnam, sir.
More significant than the landing on the moon?
I think so, sir.
Could you tell us why you think so?
Because the moon landing, you see, we weren't entirely unprepared for the moon landing. We knew it had to come sometime. We knew about the space flights, the great advances in space technology. So we knew it had to happen. I'm not saying it wasn't a remarkable achievement, but it wasn't unpredictable. The fact that they did land on the moon.
Do you think the war in Vietnam was unpredictable?
Not the war itself, but what it has revealed about the Vietnamese people, about their extraordinary power of resistance. Ordinary people, peasants, and no one knew they had it in them. And this isn't a matter of technology, it's just plain human courage, and it takes your breath away.
Are you a communist?
I don't think one has to be one in order to admire Vietnam, sir.
That doesn't answer my question. However,
you set a certain kind of photographic style when you made your first film, because Indian films used to rely a great deal on what one might call a manufactured kind of feel and look, which was highly cosmetic and did a great deal for the main actors, to make them look good and so on. And you changed it. Now, was there a very conscious attempt on your
It was very, very conscious. It was something which I discussed with my cameraman right at the start of shooting. We were both great admirers of Cartier-Bresson, and we believed in available light, source of light photography, I mean, maintaining the source as far as possible. And for day scenes, unless there was sunlight, well, for location, you chose certain times of day to shoot certain scenes. In fact, before we started, we discussed this with a lot of film people, and they said, no, you can't shoot in rain, you can't shoot on a dull day, you can't do this, you can't do that. So we made some experiments with a 16mm camera, shooting under all kinds of light conditions. We found that everything came out. So we decided to do the realistic kind of photography. But really, the available light problem showed up when we were shooting in the studio. Because for day scenes, for instance, the normal thing, normal practice in those days was to use direct lights, which would cast shadows all around. And I hated the idea of having characters move across a wall or something, which casting 4 shadows at the same, so shadows moving at the same time. So we started using bounce lights. Not so much in Pather Panchali, because in Pather Panchali the only day scenes were night scenes. Only studio scenes were night scenes. And that it didn't involve available light or bounce lighting to that extent. But in Aparajito, for instance, the house which was built in the studio, the house in which the family lived, and the only source of light there in the usual Banaras houses was from above the courtyard, which you could see the sky if you looked up, and which was open. And we had a cloth stretched right across the top, and the lights were bounced off the cloth there to suggest a kind of top source.
When you started making your films, you used to rely entirely on block lenses. And once the zoom came in, you've never left the zoom. Any particular reason in that change of style?
I think we used the zoom for the first time in Charulata. And that was the time when I started operating the camera also. Formerly my cameraman would operate, but then I started using operating myself, because I felt that looking through the Arriflex, that was the best position to watch the action from. And with the zoom, not that I used the zoom a great deal, but with the zoom, I think we were using a blimp zoom. With the zoom, I found it was very convenient in long dialogue scenes to zoom occasionally, very slightly for emphasis, which was not rehearsed. It was done, it was improvised, let us say. While watching through the lens, I felt at certain points that if I got a little closer or a little further away, it would help. And this was almost like using the zoom as a substitute for tracking, but very, very slight zooms. At other points, I occasionally use the zoom as a sort of flourish. It's hard to sort of describe it without examples, but there is, for instance, a shot in Charulata which comes at the end of the first long sequence of Charu being alone and establishing her loneliness. And the very last shot is where she watches her husband through the opera glasses, and then she, well, obviously arrives at some sort of a conclusion, and the opera glass comes down like that, and there's a zoom back immediately to a mid-shot from a close-up. And that ends the sequence. It's a sort of a flourish, as you put a flourish at the end of an article or a letter. Then, again, I felt that if I wanted to get very close to a character, right up here, which normally would, with a tracking wheel on a dolly, you would probably have to bring the camera right up to here. It would be disturbing for the actors. And then, with a zoom, you could have the camera at a distance and then zoom in to a very big close-up. This happened again in Charlotte at the time when Charu is on the swing and has her memories of her childhood. And gradually, very slowly, I bring the zoom forward, which couldn't be done with a dolly.
You are aware, of course, that with the block lens, the character and the environment have a certain kind of relationship, which does not arbitrarily change. Once you use a zoom, this tends to change because the perspective tends to get flattened.
Yes, it does. I would never, very seldom, use the zoom as a substitute for a trolley. But for certain things, for instance, a man suddenly notices an object which has some importance for him, and he reacts to it, and then we show the object. Formerly, we would dolly in if we wanted to put an emphasis. But obviously the character is not walking towards the object, it's the object which has been brought forward. So I thought the zoom was more logical to use in those circumstances.
I remember once reading somewhere about the way you locate, say you go shooting on a location. When you build a set, of course, there are very distinct positions from where you're likely to shoot from. That's how the set is designed. But when it comes to going on a location, there's you have always said that you cannot leave the familiar. There are 2 or 3 familiar positions that you're likely to take, and that's how the place gets located and recognized. I would like really for you to add something on that, because I myself have learned a great deal from it.
Well, I don't think I was particularly aware of that when I made my first film. For instance, Pather Panchali, we had this house with the courtyard, the old woman's house, the main part of the house and the kitchen. And perhaps I should have stuck to certain specific positions in order for the geography to be clearer to the audience. But watching Pather Panchali today, I find that I haven't done that to that extent. So perhaps the audience takes a little longer to realize which part of where the old woman's house is situated, where the kitchen is situated, like that. But on location, I think you don't have to be, you can't afford to be so specific in your angles, because you change your angles. Sometimes the light, the light dictates a change, sometimes, or you discover new interesting angles which you didn't discover when you for the first time found the location. That happens during the shooting all the time. But with this in mind, that you mustn't confuse the geography very much.
Yes. Now, before you came on the scene, in the Indian cinema certainly, there never used to be what one might call an ambient sound, and effects outside of the synchronized effects. Now, you started it. Now, why did you do that? I mean, what led you to use sound like that?
I think in the use of sound, we were not being very original. We were doing what the best of European cinema had done, which we admired very much. We didn't really learn from the Indian cinema. We learned, in fact, what not to do rather than what to do. So we had the examples of the best cinema of the West when we had in mind. And with Pather Panchali, as well as Aparajito, there was this question of filling long stretches of silence, because both films had very little dialogue. Naturally, we had to think of what to do there, and all sorts of sound effects were used in order basically to fill those long stretches of silence, and also at the same time for them to work as sort of ambient sound.
But didn't you suddenly come upon the idea that this could also be used creatively? Because obviously after that...
Yes, but both things at the same time. Both things at the same time, I think. You have to have both in mind. Creatively, in the sense that you add to the atmosphere, you also suggest things which are not suggested by the dialogue or by the images. Yes. So that's another dimension to the film.
Dada! Hey, Dada! কিরম একটা পাখি দেখতে শোন ওই যে दारुण तो भजुआ माने ये चिड़िया का क्या नाम है
You have also done a great deal in the use of music, because when you started, there was a thematic score, and there also used to be a lot of incidental music, which over a period of time you've not used. I mean, incidental music particularly to underline, say, an emotional moment or a climactic moment or things like that. How have you, have you ever thought of the way you have evolved in the use of music itself?
Well, in the beginning, of course, I was not my own composer. I was using other composers like Ravi Shankar and Vilas and Ali Akbar. I worked with them, and but I always knew where the music would come, and this was, I had to tell the composers beforehand that these are the points where I needed music. And so that was done, and this, of course, led to some difficulties, because I was getting musical ideas of my own at that time, and it was difficult to dictate too much to professional. I mean, they were not professional film composers, they were virtuosos, really. But Ravi Shankar particularly was very gifted also in this direction, because he had done ballet scores and all that. And that's how we worked. And later, of course, I took over composing myself, because for one thing, most of the time they were not available. And for another, I felt that since I couldn't think of another composer to use, I didn't think there were very many good professional film composers. I started doing it myself. Well, I have a piano which I strum, but I also hum and whistle a great deal. But over the years, of course, I have now come to the point where I use less and less music. Music is something which I always feel is up to a point a dispensable element. One uses music more with the public in mind than anything else, because one is afraid that the public will not be able to get the mood of a certain scene, and you want to underline it so that don't miss it, which is unfortunate, but you have to do it. I'm trying to be economical with music. Oh, there are other reasons for that. We have lost most of our musicians. They've all come to Bombay now, so we have to contend with second-rate players mostly. So one has to be inventive and use simpler things.
For instance, the trilogy has one of the most beautiful thematic lines.
Yes, that I have always believed in having leitmotifs which would reappear from time to time in a film to give it a sort of unity. I think that the main theme of Pather Panchali, for instance, was a brilliant invention of Ravi Shankar's. He had the theme in mind even before he saw the film.
Your musical ideas are Indian or Western?
No, it depends on the film really, because for a film like Pather Panchali, or perhaps any one of the trilogy films, it would have to be Indian to a large extent. But I have also tried fusion of Indian-Western idioms. This I do constantly in films which deal with contemporary Calcutta, for instance, which is in itself a kind of a fusion, the lifestyle. I have been interested in music since my school days, in classical Western music to start with. Then I got also very interested in Indian classical music. And I developed a habit of listening to Western classical music with a miniature score. And that used to be my bedside reading. I would listen to a new symphony perhaps, with a score, and then go to bed with it. And going through it, the symphony would come back to me. And that's how I learned Western notation. I mean, I didn't learn consciously at that time, but when I decided to compose, I had to teach myself Western notation. But later I discovered that most of the musicians here know Bengali notation, so I now use Bengali notation mainly. And if there's a violinist playing who knows only Western notation, that's converted into Western notation on the spot and given to him. Of course, I am a composer only 15 days of the year. The rest of the time, nothing. The piano is shut, it's not used at all. It gathers dust, that sort of thing.
Yeah, as far as editing is concerned, you kept to a fairly conventional scheme, the style of editing in your films. Haven't you felt the need, for instance, to break out of that? Didn't you feel the need, particularly in your films that didn't have very strong narrative central lines?
It's all a matter of telling the story in the best possible way.
Yes.
If I had a complex kind of a story, which I've had, and in certain films, like Days and Nights in the Forest, Arunyati Ratri and Kanchenjunga, which are not at all conventional, because they don't deal with one central character whom you follow or identify with. They're about families or a group of people where the storyline is not really conventional.
A lot has been said about the way you use your dialogues in your films, that it approximates closest to direct speech. And I'm told this is very unusual in Bengali cinema. Where did you get that from?
Actually, as I told you earlier, I didn't have much confidence as a writer of dialogue when I started, but I was lucky to have been using Vibhuti Bhushan's material. He wrote marvelous sort of lifelike speech, and I was able to lift the dialogue from the book and use it in the films. But later, when making films like, well, later on, even with Jalchagor, particularly with Parush Pathar, I started being, creative as far as dialogue writing was concerned. And gradually, what happened is that I wrote more and more sparse kind of dialogue, which was performing. It was very functional kind of dialogue. As you probably know, the dialogue is supposed to, apart from revealing characters, also advances the story and gives information. And so all these...
And also humor.
Also humor, yes.
बेगम साहबा को हमारा आदाब दे दीजिएगा और हाँ हमारे पीछे मोहरे ना पलट दीजिएगा
अल्लाह नहीं अभी बाहर मत निकलिए अभी ठीक नहीं है
कुछ हमें भी तो बताइए क्या मुसीबत आ गई
जी ये छुप रहे हैं
ये तो हम भी देख रहे हैं कि ये छुप रहे हैं मगर क्यों
वो इनके पीछे पड़ गए हैं
कौन इनके पीछे पड़ गए हैं क्या करके आए हैं साहबजादे किसी पे हाथ छोड़ बैठे हैं क्या मैं बोलते क्यों नहीं हो मुंह में दही जमा है क्या क्या हुआ जी कुछ नहीं तो कौन इनके पीछे कौन पीछे पड़ा इनके फौज पीछे पड़ गई थी फौज जी हाँ किसकी फौज हमारी फौज बादशाह की फौज अच्छा जी हाँ मोहम्मद जंग का अंदेशा है कंपनी की फौज कानपुर तक पहुंच गई है बादशाह की फौज में जबरदस्ती भर्ती हो रही है और उनके पास सिपाहियों की कमी है ना
बहुत सारे लोगों को पकड़ कर ले गए हैं वो लोग
यानी आपको भी मालूम है सब
मुझे आखिर मैंने अभी भी बताया
अच्छा सरकारी अफसर घर घर तलाशी ले रहे हैं हमारे घर भी आए थे वो
मगर ये मेहताबी से कूद कर निकल भागे
जी हाँ अच्छा मियां भागते हुए तुमने किसी देखा तो नहीं कह नहीं सकता माऊजान सरकार का सवाल था लेकिन
घोड़े की टापे तो मैंने भी सुनी थी
कब
बस आपके आने से जरा पहले टपाटप
लेकिन यहाँ छुपने की क्या जरूरत थी तुम्हारी ख्वाबगाह में कोई भी नहीं आ सकता। अब जो जी मैं
जी जी जी, बौखला गया था।
जी हाँ।
बच्चों की तरह सहम जाता है, चिड़िया सा दिल है ना। देखिए 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 ना, कैसे पत्ते की तरह कांप रहा है बेचारा।
एक कटोरा गरम दूध पिला दीजिएगा इनको। खैर मियां साहबजादे, जहां तुम बिल्कुल महफूज हो, बिल्कुल।
So it was a question of, again, trying to be as economical as possible while at the same time remembering that the functions of a dialogue. And apart from that, I suppose you have to have a good ear. You study the kind of speech various kinds of people use and eventually use that in the film. It's only when dealing with the village one uses the convention of a roughly rural speech without being too regional, consciously regional, because that gives rise to all manner of problems with the actors. So in my rural stories, well, in the trilogy, I was using the speech that Vibhuti Bhushan had written. But even later in Ashwini Shankat, again, I had to fall back on Vibhuti Bhushan for the kind of speech that he used. And this is accepted as rural speech.
There is also another thing about your children's films. Now, which you, of course, said that they are children's films for everybody. I mean, it doesn't exclude adults. But your characters, I mean, you have this special way with children, but when you deal with adult characters in these children's films, they also seem to assume childlike qualities. Is this your own sort of ideal, you know, in terms of your way of looking at the world?
I don't think a children's film calls for child actors in them. That could well be about older people. Just as Gopi Gayan, there are no children in Gopi Gayan at all playing any leading parts. These two are young men.
আমাদের খুব দেশ বেড়াও সব রাজা মশাই, যদি একটু ঘুরে টুরে বেড়াতে পারতাম। রাজা মশাই, যদি আমরা গান বাজনা করে লোককে একটু খুশি করতে পারতাম। হবে 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 গান হবে, ঢোল হবে, সুর হবে, তাল হবে, লয় হবে, লোকে শুনে দাদা চাকা তীর হয়ে থেমে যাবে, থেমে যাবে।
There is the Golden Fortress, Shonar Kella, which is based on characters which I have created over the years, a detective and his young assistant. And the original stories are all written from the point of view of this adolescent boy who is the Watson to the Sherlock Holmes of Peluda, which is usually played by Shomit.
So far, it appears that you have preference for older writers, most of who have written their work in the early years of this century. Of course, there are films that you've made with Sunil Ganguly stories and so on.
Yeah.
But is this a kind of, do you have a special preference for that period of writing? Is there some reason why you've done this over a period of time?
Well, again, I have to work this out to find out if it's true. I mean, I've done Tagore 3 or 4 times, and I've done Vibhuti Bhushan. Well, trilogy itself, that's 3 films from one writer. And then another one, Ashwini Shankat. But there is a whole series of films which are by comparatively young writers. All the contemporary city stories are either by Shonil or Shankar or by myself. I mean, Kanchenjunga. When I write original screenplays like Nayak or Kanchenjunga, I like to write about people that I know at first hand. I mean, the kind of world that I'm familiar with, the middle class and of today. The urban middle class, let us say. I couldn't write about workers in a factory. I couldn't write. But I would like to make a film about workers in a factory. But for that I need material. I need a story for that, which I haven't found yet.
Now you have, say, written material, a novel or a short story that you might use, and then in adapting it, how much do you put of your own experience, for instance, into the script before you make a film of it?
Well, I can't talk about experience to that extent because, well, the change varies from film to film. You do make changes all the time in adapting a story for a film. For instance, in Pather Panchali, it involved just cutting out characters. There were 300, I once counted about 300 characters in the segment which I've used for the film. In the film, there are about 30. So you have to cut them out in a way so that people are not aware of any sort of essential things left out. But then with Tagore, for instance, some of the early short stories have a streak of sentimentality in them, sort of Victorian attitude. And that I've had to change to give it a more hard edge, a more contemporary kind of feeling. I have done that with the Tin Kanya stories, all of them. And later with the contemporary stories from the younger writers, I have, changes have been called for because sometimes the main character has changed because in the process of preparing the script, I have noticed flaws in the development of characters. What had struck me as flaws in adapting them, and the characters have had to be given a more sort of logical development, which has brought about changes in the structure of the story itself. So that has happened. These are basically, and sometimes you work towards a conclusion. There is not a satisfactory conclusion to the original story. You must have this feeling of doing the right thing in the right circumstances. And that comes from observation, from your personal experience, although the story may be somebody else's. And there may be incidents which you have not experienced personally, directly, certainly not. But there's a thing like logic in a story which makes it ring true. Whatever you make happen on the screen, you make ring true. In Pratidwandi, for instance, I used a lot of negative images, I think, in 4 or 5 different sequences. Now, it was dictated, for instance, I'll tell you why I did it. Because the film starts with the scene of the boy's father dying and his dead body being brought down the staircase and put on the floor, garlanded, etc. Now, I felt that if I had the normal positive images, people would look for signs of life immediately. And it would be very difficult to make a convincing dead man.
हमारा क्यों আমাকে সব চলে গেল আমি কোথায় দাঁড়াবো আমরা তো পাশে আছি দিদি আমার তো কেউ নেই আমরা তো আছি দিদি আমি কি করতে দাঁড়াবো
So since I used negative in the opening sequences, I found reasons for using it as part of the language of the film in 3 or 4 other sequences. So that's how that grew in that particular film. But generally I would say that I'm not interested in form to begin with. I'm interested in the subject, and what interests me is density. How much can you tell? How telling can you make your images? And how much can you pack into a film without using gimmicks or whatever you call them, wish to call them, unconventional photographic or editing techniques? That sort of thing doesn't interest me to that extent very much. I think formally there are films which I have made, like Kanchenjunga or Days and Nights in the Forest, which are quite original, though they don't appear to be so, because the general storytelling is fairly simple. But they grapple with a lot of things, a lot of characters, and the attempt is to achieve clarity with a group of characters, with a group of situations which don't follow a normal narrative pattern.
Amiri? Rabindranath.
Mr. Ray has often referred to the influence of Western classical music on his work, Mozart's operas in particular. The ability of individual characters to maintain their individuality through elaborate ensembles. He says the memory game in Days and Nights in the Forest attempts this. The game itself is the ground base over which the 6 characters play out their individual roles in word, look, and gesture.
Cleopatra. Othello Ghosh. তোরটা বল? Yes. Helen. Helen of Troy or Bombay? Bombay.
ঠিক আছে হেলেন অফ ট্রয় ভেরি গুড
অসীম বল। রবীন্দ্রনাথ, কার্ল মার্কস, ক্লিওপ্যাট্রা, অতুল্য ঘোষ, হেলেন অফ ট্রয়, শেক্সপিয়ার।
বাবা ফাটাচ্ছে রবীন্দ্রনাথ কার্ল মার্কস ক্লিওপ্যাট্রা প্রফুল্ল
আউট
কি করে ভুল করলাম এ রাম অতুল্য
থামুন, আপনি তো চাঁদামিজি করে আমাকে ভুলিয়ে দেবেন দেখছি।
সব ভুলে গেলাম
রবীন্দ্রনাথ, কার্ল মার্কস, ক্লিওপ্যাট্রা, অতুল্য ঘোষ, হেলেন অফ ট্রয়, শেক্সপিয়ার, আউট, মাও সেতুং।
রবীন্দ্রনাথ কার্ল মার্কস ক্লিওপ্যাট্রা অতুল্য ঘোষ হেলেন অফ ট্রয় শেক্সপিয়ার মাও সেতুং ডন ব্র্যাডম্যান
দাঁড়ান বলছি। রবীন্দ্রনাথ, কার্ল মার্কস, ক্লিওপ্যাট্রা, অতুল্য ঘোষ, হেলেন, মাও সেতুং।
কি হয়েছে? জায়গায় বস।
বসো, যাবি কোথায়?
বসতে হবে।
রবীন্দ্রনাথ, কার্ল মার্কস, ক্লিওপ্যাট্রা, অতুল্য ঘোষ, হেলেন অফ ট্রয়, শেক্সপিয়ার, আউট, মাও সেতুং, ডন ব্র্যাডম্যান, আউট, রানী রাসমণি। সঞ্জয়, লড়ে যা। না। রবীন্দ্রনাথ, কার্ল মার্কস, ক্লিওপ্যাট্রা, অতুল্য ঘোষ, হেলেন অফ ট্রয়, শেক্সপিয়ার, আউট, মাও সেতুং। আপনি যেন কি বললেন?
না
আচ্ছা, এর কোনো টাইম লিমিট নেই? আছে, 10 সেকেন্ডস। আমি করে দিচ্ছি। 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 ব্ল্যাঙ্ক। আউট।
ব্র্যাডম্যান রবীন্দ্রনাথ কার্ল মার্কস ক্লিওপ্যাট্রা অতুল্য ঘোষ হেলেন অফ ট্রয় শেক্সপিয়ার মাও সেতুং ডন ব্র্যাডম্যান রানী রাসমণি কেনেডি।
Which Kennedy?
ববি।
রবীন্দ্রনাথ, কার্ল মার্কস, ক্লিওপ্যাট্রা, অতুল্য ঘোষ, বালিশ, হেলেন অফ ট্রয়, শেক্সপিয়ার, মাও সেতুং, ব্র্যাডম্যান, রানী রাসমণি, ববি কেনেডি, টেকচাঁদ ঠাকুর।
হ্যাঁ নিশ্চয়ই। রবীন্দ্রনাথ কার্ল মার্কস ক্লিওপ্যাট্রা রানী রাসমণি কেনেডি টেকচাঁদ ঠাকুর নেপোলিয়ন। থ্যাংক ইউ।
রবীন্দ্রনাথ, কার্ল মার্কস, ক্লিওপ্যাট্রা, অতুল্য ঘোষ, হেলেন অফ ট্রয়,
আপনার সাঁওতালি গায়না ভালো লাগে? সাঁওতালি গায়না ভালো লাগে?
সাঁওতালদের গায়ে নিশ্চয়ই ভালো লাগে। ডন ব্র্যাডম্যান,
মন্ত্রীর জন্য কিনতে হবে।
রানী রাসমণি, কেনেডি, কেনেডি টেকচাঁদ ঠাকুর, নেপোলিয়ন, মমতাজ মহল।
বলুন, রেডি দেবে।
বোধহয় পারবো না।
সে কি রে, তুই মনে করতে পারছিস না?
আমার হরিবাবুর দশা হয়েছে।
তুই বলতে চাস তোর গোড়ার নামগুলো মনে পড়ছে না?
একটু ঠান্ডা জল খাবেন? কোট জল?
না, আউট। অসীম বাবু দিদি।
You've always been an observer of, let's say, of reality, if I may use the term. And whatever statements you had to make have always been oblique.
By temperament, I think I'm a filmmaker who likes to be oblique, if such a thing is possible, or valid in relation to the subject.
হা করে দেখছো কি? আমি কি নতুন নাকি?
প্রধান, তুমি কি তোমার কি হয়েছিল ওঠা? তুমি কত ভালো লিখেছো তুমি তা জানো? আমি যখন তোমাকে গ্রামের কথা লিখতে বলেছিলাম তখন আমি কল্পনাও করতে পারিনি তুমি এত ভালো লিখবে। সত্যি বিশ্বাস করো, আমি একদম বোকা বনে গিয়েছি। এত সহজ, এত স্বচ্ছন্দ তোমার লেখা থাকলে চলবে না বৌঠান। তোমায় লিখতে হবে, আরো লিখতে হবে। তার মানে তোমার এত গুণ।
আমি আর লিখবো না, আমি আর লিখবো না।
কাঁদছো কেন ভাই? কে গেল?
সত্যি তো কি বোকা আমি। ইস, জামাটা ভিজে গেছে।
ব্লাড সুগার, হাই প্রেশার, কোলেস্টেরল, আর আমার ডক্টর বড় কড়া ডক্টর আছে। বলেন কি, আপনি সিগারেটও খান না? আপনার তাহলে মনের জোর আছে বলতে হবে। স্মোকিং করি না অবশ্য ক্যান্সার হওয়ার ভয়ে।
মা, মা, সাদা ফুল কালো রং দিয়ে আসছি। সাদা রং নেই, আমি কালো দিয়ে আসছি কিন্তু মা, সাদা রং নেই।
আমি তো বলেছি।
কি বলেছো?
আমি তো বলেছি আই এম সরি।
সরি বলে কি সাতক্ষণ মাফ হয়?
তুমি এমন করছো না যেন রোজ এরকম হয়।
এবার থেকে হবে। তোমার পরিষ্কার বলে দেওয়া উচিত ছিল আজ হবে না, আজ এসো না, আজ অসুবিধা আছে।
তুমি আর আসবে না।
আজ খুব শিক্ষা হয়েছে আমার।
আর
দাদু, দাদু,
Your status in the Indian film has been one of what one might call splendid isolation. You've been quite alone in what you have been doing and with the kind of concerns you've shown in your films. Now, has that affected you in any way? Because there hasn't been enough of a kind of bouncing board to react against or to place yourself in the milieu.
Well, this is not something of my own creation. I mean, one would have wanted, for instance, to start a trend, a whole new trend or something like that. But we have had directors here in Bengal, a couple of directors certainly, who've been working almost simultaneously with me. They started about the same time as I did, like Hrithik and Mrinal. They were both working fairly, not Hrithik so much. Mrinal worked fairly regularly, and then Hrithik off and on was making a film very different from mine, very different, but very powerful, I think, very powerful. So it was all, and in any case, filmmaking has so many hassles. It's so problematic here. To get a film done, one stops thinking of whether there's a school of filmmaking, whether you're creating a school, whether others following in your footsteps. You just keep on working, because after all, it's also a living. And you make a living and you express yourself at the same time, crossing many obstacles on the way. Filmmaking has never been easy here. Certainly not.
But doesn't it, do you feel the need that you do require kind of a stimulus outside of the one that you generate for yourself as a filmmaker?
What stimulus are you talking about? Because by and large, my films, many of my films have been received well, for instance, if not here, sometimes abroad. So there has been a sense of satisfaction after making a film. Nothing, almost nothing, with the exception of 2 or 3, which either didn't export or didn't go down well here. Most of the films have eventually had been successful, in the sense that either money, almost none of my films have not lost money. Eventually, in course of time, they have brought back their cost. So it's been more or less, a feeling has been a fairly happy one. But the difficult part has been the making of it. It takes a long time to gauge an audience. You know, one makes a film with a sort of ideal audience in mind. And one hopes that what oneself likes, gets excited about, or finds absorbing, there will be an audience to have the same sort of reaction to the film once it's made. But in the early stages, I think I made many mistakes, because, for instance, Pather Panchali was a great success. Aparajita was not. It was a failure from the box office point of view, and that applies to Aparajita all over the world. It's the same reaction everywhere, which is very interesting, because you obviously have a kind of standard general audience reaction to a film, which, regardless of where the audience is. But watching the film with the audience, one realizes there are mistakes in the film. And the mistake is not perhaps in the audience, but in the maker. Since I have tried not to repeat myself, there has been an element of risk in almost everything I have done, because I was trying out something new, something which the audience had not seen before. So it's been like that. And also the fact is that the audience has grown over the years, has become more mature, more sophisticated over the years, partly due to the Film Society movement, and partly the fact that seeing my latest film has been a sort of necessary cultural sort of necessity, and they have followed my trend very carefully. I'm talking only of the urban audience now. I don't really know what happens outside of the city limits. May have had something to do with what I inherited from my family, from my father's side, mother's side.
No, because it also reflects a very strong rationalist kind of streak.
Yes.
Which also to some extent might be your Brahmo upbringing.
Could be, although one is not conscious of it, because we were born Brahmos, you know, actually the conversion had taken place much earlier. So naturally from my household I was imbibing certain values, certain attitudes, even from my childhood, which one was not doing consciously, but it was just there. It was just things that we observed and learned through observation. Must have been that.
Yeah. When did you start to feel being affected by your environment? At what stage in your life where you would sort of look at life and relate to other people? Let's say say for instance the problems of the city of Calcutta itself?
Well, as an illustrator, I was an illustrator before I was a filmmaker. As an illustrator, one has to be very observant, you know, observing people's behavior. When you illustrate, if you're a realistic kind of an illustrator, which I was, I had also done a lot of stylized work, but there was a lot of realistic illustration work which calls for a great deal of observation of people's behaviors, physical types, and environment, and this and that. So that had already happened, even during my advertising days. I think there is anger when there is anger, when anger is called for, anger is needed, as you'll probably find in my latest film. But at other times, I have, as you say, converted it into irony. There's something which, a remark which my professor in Shantiniketan made, Mr. Nandalal Bose, he once said, apropos of what I have forgotten, that there are two kinds of people. One, the very angry people who give vent to their anger. But he said that I feel the stronger person is the angry man who can control his anger. Stronger than the person who gives vent to his anger. That struck me as a very interesting remark. And irony, of course, has appealed to me all along, I think. Why, I can't say. Perhaps because life itself is ironic when you juxtapose it with death.
Yes.
You know.